Good day to all of our participants around the world. Thank you for joining us. My name is Carlos Ruiz, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on the IRENA Project Navigator. The purpose of this webinar is to introduce the new guidelines for Woody Biomass projects. Before we begin, we would like to share a quick note that IRENA does not endorse or recommend specific products or services shared within its webinar series. If you are interested in finding out about future webinars offered through the IRENA Project Navigator webinar series, or if you're interested in learning about renewable energy project development, please visit the IRENA Project Navigator website. For today's webinar, we have two options for listening in. You may connect by computer by selecting mic and speakers, or by phone by selecting the telephone option in the right-hand panel. Should you face any technical difficulties during the webinar, please contact GoToWebinar Help Desk at the number provided on your screen. Throughout the webinar, we will be asking for your feedback in order to know your opinion and help us improve our webinar series. When this happens, you will see questions pop up on your screen, and you will simply need to select your choice. We would also like to encourage everyone to participate in today's session by asking questions. To do so, simply select the questions panel in the right-hand bar and enter your question with a note of who you would like to direct your question to. We will be collecting questions throughout the webinar and answering them at the end of our webinar. The IRENA Project Navigator is launching its guidelines for developing woody biomass projects. Today's webinar is the third in a series of Project Navigator webinars introducing the Navigator's newest developments. The next webinars in the series will focus on other technologies. There will be more webinars in the future focusing on mini-grid applications, residential PV, small hydropower, and geothermal power projects. We invite you to join us for these upcoming webinars. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. Our first speaker is Dolf Gillen, Director of the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. Dolf oversees the center's work in advising member countries in the area of technology status and roadmaps, energy planning, costs, markets, and innovative policy frameworks. Second, we will hear from Jeffrey Skier, Senior Program Officer for Technology Cooperation at IRENA. Jeff is currently leading IRENA's work assessing sustainable bioenergy potential and pathways to realize it. We are also joined today by Simon Bemarras, analyst for the Project Navigator at IRENA. Simon has more than 6 years of experience in the renewable energy sector, developing projects for power and industrial applications, and building partnerships with stakeholders in different sectors. Next is our first guest speaker, Cornelius Sushi. Cornelius is the CEO of Canadian Biomass Energy Research Limited, a consulting engineering firm focusing on biomass to energy projects. Cornelius has many years of experience in the field and has worked on projects all over the globe. Our second guest speaker is Martin Darpier, Director of Envin Consulting. Martin has over 2 decades working with bioenergy with both the private and public sectors. Finally, I will introduce myself. My name is Carlos Ruiz. I am a junior professional associate here at IRENA working on the Project Navigator, and I have been developing technical project guidelines for the last 3 years. I would like now to start our presentations by handing the floor to our director, Dolf Gillen.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Hello, everyone. I would like to say a few words about the context. What is IRENA and how does fit bioenergy in the overall energy development as we see it? So International Renewable Energy Agency is a relatively new international agency established 6 years ago. Its objective is to accelerate global deployment of sustainable renewable energy, and bioenergy is one of the 6 forms of renewable energy that we work on, and we do that through the provision of information, knowledge and information in this area, in terms of resource availability, in terms of costing, in terms of environmental impacts, etc. In terms also of technologies and innovation in this area. We also have an important role in bringing stakeholders together to work on specific issues, and we provide technical advice to member countries. And finally, we act as a global voice for renewable energy. At this moment, we have 150 member countries, and there's 26 states in accession, so it's really a global agency. Now, as part of our work, we also prepare forward-looking studies, and one of these programs under the heading of which we do that is called the REMAP, which is a road mapping. We have issued last year a study for 2030, and 20th of March we will launch a new edition with a focus on 2050. And as part of the REMAP program, we are currently working with 70 countries covering 90% of global energy use, and we look at what will happen with renewable energy deployment till 2030 with policies in place, and what do we see as additional renewable options, and what are the costs and benefits of these options. So what this graph shows you is how the energy demand would develop in a reference case, and how that energy demand could change if all the renewable options were developed. And what you see there is that if you look at the rightmost bar, that the deployment of renewables in a reference case, policies in place, would take us to around 125 exajoules of primary energy. But if the additional options were deployed that we have identified through REMAP, then the use of renewables could grow to 175 exajoules per year, and the use of fossil fuels would drop accordingly. So, and a very important finding is then the economics of such a change. And what we find is that there are some additional costs involved. These additional costs are relatively small. Well, you might say 290 billion is a big sum, but you have to compare that to today's world GDP, which is more than 100 trillion. So that's manageable. And moreover, if you compare these costs with the benefits in terms of reduced health impacts and in terms of reduced climate change impacts, then the benefits exceed the cost by a factor 4 to 15. So there's a very strong rationale for such policy. Now, in recent years, climate change has come much more to the foreground as a driver, and so we assessed also through REMAP what can you do with renewables in the context of climate change, and our conclusion is that renewables have to play a key role. They account for more than half of the CO2 emission reduction potential in 2030, and the combination of energy efficiency and renewable energy can keep the world on a path to 2 and maybe even 1.5 degrees climate change. Now, the REMAP findings also show that bioenergy plays really a key role in the overall renewables potential. It is, as you probably know, 3/4 of renewable energy deployment today, but even in the future we think it can account for around half of total renewable energy use. And with that I hand over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dov, for your presentation. I would like now to ask Jeffrey Skier, to give us some more insights on bioenergy potentials and pathways.
Okay, so as Ulf mentioned, biomass is a very big part of the picture in terms of the renewable energy options identified in our remap exercise. And here we see the picture of biomass today, or to 2010, versus what could be the picture in 2030 in terms of primary biomass applied to different end-use sectors. And what you can see looking at the left-hand pie chart is that half of all the current primary bioenergy use, shown in dark blue, is traditional biomass, which is basically wood fires and cook stoves, many in developing countries. The other half is divided evenly between four different sectors, between heating systems for buildings, shown in yellow, industrial process heat, shown in gray, electric power, shown in orange, and transport biofuels, shown in sky blue. And the remap suggests that overall biomass use could and should nearly double, with modern biomass use more than tripling from 26 exajoules in 2010 to 94 exajoules in 2030, as the traditional uses are modernized. So you see the picture on the right-hand side, we still have a fairly even division between the four different sectors. And of course, this raises a very important question, which is, where is all this biomass going to come from? And we would suggest that a fairly substantial portion of it will probably come from wood. And the next slide, we will look at some pockets of sustainable bioenergy. There's a lot of pockets of sustainable bioenergy. We've estimated different amounts in a study we have called Boosting Biofuels, which you can Google and read all the details. But basically, we have several different options. We have closing the yield gap. Today, the typical yield on food crops is a little over 4 tons per hectare. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations projects it may rise to 5 tons per hectare by 2050. But the potential yield, adjusting for rainfall and soils around the world, is actually around double that, or around 10 tons per hectare. So a big potential there. We estimate if we were to close the yield gap, up to 550 million hectares could theoretically become available for energy crops. And then another sustainable potential area is better use of pasture land. In fact, there's about as much good and prime pasture land as good and prime crop land, but the pasture land only produces 3% of all food, and we think that there are good examples of how to raise the efficiency of livestock production by a factor of 4. So with that, we could imagine some 950 million hectares becoming available for bioenergy crops. Then a third important area is reduced losses in the food chain. Amazingly, about 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. And we looked at what could happen if every region adopted the best practice available in regions today, and we could reduce those waste and losses by about half, making available some 270 million hectares on the land that would no longer be needed to grow the food that was no longer lost or wasted. And in the next slide, I'm going to show, not yet, but there's also very important options for forest landscape restoration. If you add it all up, some 2 billion hectares could become available for raising, in theory, additional bioenergy crops without conflicting with food production and without requiring additional land. And if you were to assume an average yield of 10 tons per hectare for woody crops, which is conservative. Now, woody crops are very different from food crops. They have a higher energy content because the plants are focused on producing energy rather than producing food, which is a bit more complicated. And so if you assume 10 tons per hectare, which is actually conservative, and an average energy content of 15 gigajoules per ton, this would equate to over 300 exajoules of biomass. And converted to biofuels, advanced biofuels at 40% efficiency, that would supply most or all of the world's liquid transport fuel needs in 2050. Or you could assume it's converted at 80% efficiency to a mix of conventional biofuels, heat and power. And in addition, there's potential for expanding biofuel production in productive forests by making more thorough use of residual wood from timber production, because timber is worth about 8 times as much as the residual in the forest. So the forests are planted and managed for that wood, and very often the residuals are not collected. It's just not economically worthwhile in many cases. So that's potential. And then also it's possible to better manage the forest to improve the yields while also expanding the forest. We get energy and more carbon sequestration at the same time. So that's there's a lot of sustainable potential there. And now looking in particular at the forest landscape restoration, you may know about the Bonn Challenge and the New York Declaration, which have committed countries to restore 350 million hectares of degraded land by 2030, or at least to pledge that amount of land to be restored by 2030. We're still figuring out the time schedule. And the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, also called AFR 100, which was launched at COP21 in Paris, aims to restore 100 million of these 350 million hectares. When we drew this map, it had already been joined by 15 African countries, which together had pledged to restore 55 million hectares. And I understand from my colleagues the number is now up to closer to 75. So this is a great opportunity to try out different agroforestry approaches, including short rotation coppice wood that can be harvested every few years for energy. And the idea there is, and we'll explain a little bit more about that in the next slides. Basically, we can think of, based upon the experience in the world to date, there's kind of 2 different models of wood production. And the first one I'm going to discuss is the planted forest model. And this has been successfully applied in Europe and North America, and it's based upon long-term nurturing and management of planted forests. This model requires strong land tenure so that the foresters have an incentive to plant more trees on the same land and to harvest them for long-lasting, high-value uses, like the lumber that I mentioned. Most of the wood is not burned for energy, at least right away. Rather, trees are grown for the lumber, which fetches several times the market price of energy wood. And the lumber, for the most part, goes to build houses where it reduces carbon emissions by displacing cement. And so as I was saying, we have the planted wood in planted forests, and the wood can be used, the lumber can be used to displace cement in houses, and houses last a long time. And meanwhile, they continue to sequester the carbon in the wood they contain. And meanwhile, new trees are planted to store additional carbon, and only the complementary fellings or residues are used for energy. And these residues are burned in highly efficient combined heat and power plants, district heating systems, and home furnaces, where they displace carbon emissions from less efficient systems fueled by natural gas and coal, or even by oil. So this is a story of how wood use can be very sustainable, and this has been successfully shown in Europe and North America. And another model is a short rotation model, and you may have heard of short rotation coppice, where you have plants that grow very rapidly, woody plants, and they can be harvested on a short-term basis. So now this model is particularly suited to developing countries where farmers typically have small plots of around a hectare or less, and where land tenure is less secure. And that's why a short rotation process makes sense. High-yielding high-yielding tree species like, for example, Gliricidia and Acacia are grown together with food crops in what we call an agroforestry approach. And since the tree species are often nitrogen-fixing, they're essentially providing natural fertilizer. And that means they can double or triple the food crop yield, so that you can have some wood for energy production without reducing food production. So that's a very important combination. And the wood is harvested every year or every few years so that carbon uptake and release are kept in balance. And the wood can be used not only for modern heat and power systems, as I described in the planted forest model, but also to accelerate the conversion of traditional wood stoves to modern cook stoves, with double or triple the efficiency and much less indoor smoke. So this means better health, less time required to collect wood for the women and children in the developing countries, and less pressure from wood collection on the environmental balance and biodiversity in the local forests.
Thank you for your presentation, Jeff. Before we go into the specifics of the Navigator bioenergy module, I would like to provide a bit of a background on the Project Navigator itself and the challenge of developing renewable energy technology projects. The challenge in deploying renewable energy does not really lie in a lack of resource potentials. The challenge is more about how to translate this into projects on the ground. It is often the case that not the project developers or the involved administrations have a realistic understanding of the processes, the timelines, and the steps that are really required to complete a bankable project proposals. In fact, they are rarely focused on achieving bankability. This can easily translate into higher project development costs and a higher risk of project failure. Even when a bankable project proposal is delivered, sometimes the process of identifying potential opportunities for funding and securing finance is not entirely transparent. So IRENA has taken the task to make the whole process more transparent, and we are doing this, among others, through the Navigator. So the Project Navigator is a free online platform providing comprehensive and easily accessible information. It also provides tools and guidance to assist with the development of bankable renewable energy projects. The scope of the Navigator covers the entire project development process, from identifying an idea to actually developing the project. And it also cuts across most renewable energy technologies, including bioenergy, solar, wind, geothermal energy, hydropower, and we're also working on renewable energy mini-grids. The Project Navigator, as you can see on this slide, is comprised of three main parts. The first part is the learning section, the second part is an interactive workspace, and the last part is the financial navigator. The first part, the learning section, is basically broken down into three main sections. The first one is what we call the Project Development Guidelines, which provide general information on project planning, and they explain the suggested project development process and the tools that we have. The second part of the learning section are the technical guidelines. Here we aim to cover all technology-specific aspects, including required standards, risk evaluation processes, technical aspects related to the site and resource assessment, technology selection, and the logistics of a project. Finally, the How Others Did It section compiles all the tools, templates, and examples, also case studies that users can download and easily search through and download. The second part of the Navigator is an interactive workspace. Here users can start their own projects after filling in some basic information. This private workspace allows users to follow a stepwise process, store their information, track their progress, and access specialized tools which will help them develop their projects. The last part of the Navigator is what we call the Financial Navigator. The Financial Navigator allows users to browse through a database of over 30 international funding options, and they can access detailed information on their size, their coverage, their requirements, contact points, and many other things. Today's webinar is centered on the technical concept guidelines, more specifically for Woody Biomass projects, and they are now available online. On the platform, you will be able to easily navigate through the guidelines and have quick access to tools, templates, and examples. My colleague Simon Ben Maras will now guide you through the structures of the content of these guidelines, and he will explain the particularities related to developing Woody Biomass projects.
Thank you, Carlos, for this presentation of the Navigator platform. Let's start with the early project development phase, where the developer will start to tailor successful development activities. Most bioenergy projects are initiated in response to a demand, for example, an energy shortage or high fuel prices, or also a unique opportunity, for example, a large available feedstock or a new technology that was recently introduced. It's important to remind us that the business idea needs to combine aspects of feedstock, market, and technology. The second phase of the guidelines is about evaluating the combination of feedstock, technology and market for their suitability and compatibility, matching a raw material to a market and a technology. Our guidelines address typical showstoppers, issues that can cause a biofuel project to fail. The project, for example, should be checked for these early showstoppers very early in the development process, before too much time, energy and resources have been invested. On the next slide, we are now in the assessment phase. So during this phase, the developer will compare and assess in detail all project options that have passed the screening process. Economic considerations such as the cost of feedstock and the market price of the biofuel come into play. It might take several iterations to identify the optimum plant size, the sweet spot between cost and plant capacity. The guidelines provide a SWOT template that will help developers to analyze, assess and rank options for feedstock, technology, market and sites. The project developer should also look at what other developers have done in the past, preferably in the region and jurisdiction of the proposed plant. We always recommend to have a couple of site visits and also discussion with existing plant owner and operator to ensure that you collect all useful information to prepare the development activity. On the fourth stage, called the selection phase, developers should have acquired enough information to discriminate among project alternatives, including the feedstock, the main processing technology, the market, the plant size or its sites. These choices may be made or questioned by people outside your team based on information gathered during the previous phases. It is essential to have this information available in a concise format. We provide what we call a valuation report to help developers to summarize the selection process and clearly present the choices that led to the proposed project concept. This report can be submitted to project decision maker. Those decision makers will be evaluating the bankability of each of the project alternatives and also may ask the relative financial viability for those alternatives. They will challenge you on the potential showstoppers and ask, do you have acquired long-term feedstock contracts? And also, did you take into account the availability of proper human resources? We are now in what we call the late stage development phase. So during the pre-development stage, technical and economic plannings are the key task. Major engineering studies are performed, including the conceptual design of the processing plant. These design activities form the basis for permitting, licensing, and other authorizations that are required. And with that, you can start the front-end engineering design, the FEED study of your project. On the economic side, feedstock supply and sale of the biofuel project should be formalized by MOUs, Memorandum of Understanding. Ownership models, cost estimate, and the financial evaluation should be condensed in a business plan that can be used to prepare discussion on the financing option for your project. The guidelines provide a business plan template, and this template should be backed by written agreement with feedstock providers, product off-takers, with all relevant terms and conditions for pricing, quality, and delivery terms. Investors and banks will generally consider financing a bioenergy project only if after a feedstock supply agreement and an off-take agreement are in place. A lender might also limit the term of the loan to the period of these agreements. Where no agreement can be obtained, developers should produce independent third-party feedstock assessment that show that sufficient feedstock is available over the long term. Off-takers such as utilities with large enough balance sheets to support the agreement usually require annual volumes in excess to what small to medium-sized project can deliver. Therefore, selling to a well-established market or the submission of a solid market assessment will reduce the investment risks. One important element is the risk analysis. The developer should prepare a risk management plan with all major risks listed and also where all mitigation measures have been put into place. So also in the guidelines we provide a risk analysis plan with the typical risks for a biofuel project. Once completed, this business plan will be used to convince potential investors to support financially the project. We are now in the development phase, so this is the last stage before the financial closure of the project. In this critical phase, all activities previously performed are finalized to decide with the team and stakeholders if and when the project is deemed bankable. A project is generally considered bankable if a bank or lenders are willing to finance it. Each lender and investor have specific criteria to judge whether a project is bankable. Specifically, bankability means that the results of the financial modeling are in line with the expectation of investors and lenders. For developers, it's simple. They should obtain all report for engineering, secure all permitting, negotiate the last term sheet with the investors and turns MOUs into actual contract. Questions to be addressed include who will operate the plant, what will contractual agreement for construction look like, and what is the project financing structure. A bankable financial model, a technical design of the facility, and a land purchase or leasing agreement should be produced at this time. They are all supported by tools and templates available in the guidelines. The development phase concludes with the project financial closure, where all agreements are signed with investors and lenders. Investors may prefer particular ownerships and operation model that will affect those discussions. You have to be reminded that also insurance company may have additional concern that may affect the final design and budget of your project. Let's also look a bit forward in the construction, in the implementation phase. This is also important for developer to anticipate those phases to convince investors and lenders to join the project. So the construction phase typically stretch from equipment procurement to construction, installation, and plant commissioning. Construction, of course, presupposes that permits have been obtained, financing is closed, and the site is under the developer's control, whether it was leased or purchased. To prepare the construction phase, the developer should provide a proper allocation of responsibilities. Key concerns during construction are generally cost, quality, and planning control measures. Adequate contingency should be built into the construction schedule to allow for interruption or delays with deliveries, transportation, or even blackout times, for example, holiday seasons. Specification for civil work should have been obtained from vendors, and all activities should be have been aligned to prepare installation work. Some training will be conducted by your vendors, but ultimately the owner must assume overall responsibility, especially for health and safety training. This phase is governed by a project master plan and results in a commissioning report and acceptance certificate for key plan components. Manuals and written procedures must be in place for the commissioning. In the operation phase, a key concern is to achieve and consistently maintain projected production levels and product quality. Feedstock quality and best storage and processing practices should be closely monitored. This requires skills and practices to be acquired and applied in the plant operation plan. Optimizing the plant operation may take more than a year. Keeping a plant at the optimum output is a task that is ongoing throughout the lifetime of the plant. Constant maintenance, fine-tuning, and adjustments are necessary to maintain smooth operation and uniform product parameters. During this phase, the financial model of the project will be updated. New project may be undertaken and will allow a similar development sequence as the original project. Operating procedures are updated and personnel are trained. Incoming feedstock must be tested and product quality monitored. Management will also seek to improve overall plant efficiency, optimizing operation and investigating new market routes. In the technical guidelines we are providing, we are also providing information for the developer to prepare decommissioning activity. At the end of the project lifecycle, due maybe to unforeseen circumstances, a biofuel plant may either be retooled and continue operation or be decommissioned. The latter is governed by regulation and should also include stakeholder input. Decommissioning may include the recovery of any marketable materials and equipment, the orderly and safe removal of installation and buildings, and site rehabilitation. The detail of the process will depend on whether the site or any of its assets will be used by another operation afterwards. A decommissioning plan needs to be prepared and funds should be set aside to cover these costs. So this is the general approach we are proposing to develop a Woody Biomass project. You will see that in the guidelines all those information are identified, and for each time you need to use a tool also there is a reference and you can directly download the tools, and there is a guidance on how to use, whether it's a template, a checklist or a model.
Thank you very much, Simon. Before we move on to our guest speaker interventions, we would like to know your opinion about the bioenergy technology you think we should focus on next. You will see a question pop up on your screen, and you simply need to select your choice. Thank you for your feedback. I would like now to hand the floor to our first guest speaker, Cornelius Suchi from Canadian Biomass Energy Research Limited.
Thank you, Carlos. Yeah, what do you need to understand as a developer or as a banker or a political decision maker, even as somebody from the academic field, is that biomass is a renewable energy, but it's a different renewable energy, different from, let's say, wind, solar, or hydro. Biomass is, in a sense, stored solar energy, but the resource is limited. Overharvesting the sun is impossible, but deforestation can become a problem and has happened. But there are also key advantages of bioenergy in comparison to sun, wind, and hydropower. It doesn't peak only at certain times, it can be easily stored, and it's available when you need it rather than when the sun, the wind, or the waves are available. Next slide, please. Most biomass energy projects are initiated in response to a demand, for example, an energy shortage or excessively high fuel prices, or as a unique opportunity, for example, an abundant feedstock or an interesting new technology. A business idea, however, needs to combine all aspects of feedstock, market, and technologies. Next slide, please. There are many pathways from a feedstock to the market. Some of these are illustrated in the graph. Focusing only on one of these three aspects is unlikely to result in a viable project. The developer needs to look at the combination of feedstock, market, and technology to succeed. This is different from other renewable energy sources where the resource, wind, sun, water, waves, they are taken for granted. You can't do so for biomass. The market for a biofuel is also subject to fluctuations that projects feeding electricity into a utility grid rarely face, or at least not to the same extent. This makes developing bioenergy projects more challenging than other renewable energy projects. Next slide, please. Two key feedstocks can be separated, woody and herbaceous biomass. Woody biomass comes from forestry-related activities, sometimes as a byproduct or product of plantations. Herbaceous biomass, such as straw and husky feedstock, is usually derived from agriculture. There are key differences between the two. Agricultural byproducts usually only occur on a seasonal basis, while forestry is done year-round. There's no need or less need for seasonal storage with woody biomass. Herbaceous feedstock such as straw is rather bulky, requiring large space for storage. Moreover, herbaceous biomass decomposes much faster than woody biomass. Finally, the ash content and the chemical composition of the ash makes burning herbaceous feedstocks much more difficult than woody feedstock. Herbaceous feedstock can be turned into a valuable biofuel, but the process is more involved compared to woody resources. Keep this in mind when selecting your feedstock. Next slide, please. When identifying the market for biofuel, two categories can be served, a local, decentralized, or an international or export market. Both come with their own requirements. Identifying the market that the biomass fuel should serve is an important first step. A market for biofuel sales may present itself for a number of reasons, such as lower fuel prices, fuel shortages, government policies, including GHG management, carbon taxes, sales tax exemptions, regulations obliging large greenhouse gas emitters to reduce their emissions, such as cap and trade schemes or GHG emission limits for coal power plants, or simply convenience, such as a cleaner burning fuel or avoided effort to gather the fuel. Knowledge of these conditions will be the foundation for identifying the market, a niche, and its limitations. Next slide, please. Biomass is all about logistics, and again, that's different from usual renewable energy sources like wind, solar. Biomass needs to be pre-treated and processed to be sold as a biofuel. Pre-treatment may be as simple as cutting the biomass to a convenient size, but usually there's more involved. Not all the processes shown here need to be applied. Some markets might require less refined or differently processed biofuels than others. In either case, the logistics of accessing these resources, the pre-processing and the safeguarding the feedstock, the processing itself, storing the final product, and getting it to market are rather complex. As a rule of thumb, the more refined your biofuel, the more complex the process and the associated logistics. It may take years to optimize this supply chain. And other than with solar, wind or hydropower, the resource might dry up. The supply chain may be disrupted or the market might disappear. So contingency planning is a key part of biofuel projects. Next slide, please. Biofuel projects are complex and multifaceted. They typically involve more stakeholders than other renewable energy sources. Identifying parties involved is a first step towards a successful project. What you see here on the slides is possible stakeholders. These are part of a medium to large-scale biomass fuel production plant. For small-scale projects serving a local or domestic market, the list of stakeholders may be simpler than shown. Next slide, please. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Cornelius.
Thank you, Simon.
I would like now to ask our second guest speaker, Martin Tampier from Endin Consulting, to provide us with some more insights with a case study.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. So next slide, please. Yes, there we go. This is just an idea to illustrate a bit what we heard before from Simon, who went through the 9 project development steps, and Cornelius, who was talking about the particularities of biomass specifically. So we just looked for public information. So this is a case study on a project in India from the last few years, around 2009, 2010. and it covers most of the steps, the 9 steps of project development. Obviously not the last one, because the company is still up and running and expanding, so we're not talking about decommissioning today, but all the other steps are pretty much included. What you will notice, obviously I'm not talking very much about the financial side of things, because you will just not find information on these details in the public domain. But we have, as part of the guide or the guidelines, a financial tool and a business development tool where you can see kind of a fictitious case study that goes more into much more detail about the financial side of things. So if you're looking for more information on that, you will find that online. So here is a kind of a mid-sized plant being developed that focuses on both agricultural and woody feedstocks, for a company trying to diversify its portfolio. Next slide, please. So we are looking at the first 3 phases of the project development process here. So this is a pharmaceutical company trying to diversify into different areas. They already had some experience with using biofuels themselves and saw a business opportunity here. They were situated in an area with lots of agricultural and forestry activity, and just said, well, let's do something in this area. And they were ambitious and also wanted to contribute to sustainability goals in this area. So they were saying, yes, we should involve farmers as well. We should use agricultural biomass and resolve a number of problems. So their context was determined by high rates of salination. Agricultural land was degrading rapidly. People were burning residue in the field, lots of pollution being caused by that. At the same time, there was a shortage of coal in the industrial sector, so there was several doors opening to them, so to say. So they had already screened and assessed different opportunities, including biogas, and were then focusing on solid biomass as a fuel, because that had come out as the best opportunity of the ones that were presenting themselves. Next slide, please. So here we go to steps number 4 and 5 of the project development process. So we're talking about selection and pre-development. So here we see how the project was set up. So the company was looking at the different feedstock sources, talking to farmers and organizations, and doing first trials at a site to use biomass. They were doing obviously their calculations, seeing how much could they get for the fuel, how much would they pay for the feedstock, and everything looked very good on paper. You can see down at the last bullet point, they were only paying about $11 US for a ton of fuel, and would get almost $100 for a ton of sold fuel, even though you only get about half a ton of pellets per ton of fuel. It's still a fairly good return. So everything looked very good at that point. Next slide, please. So we're going into development and construction. Now the company didn't have many problems, it seems, with financing the project, which is often a big obstacle to developing such projects, because in this case, as I said, it's a mid-sized plant, about 60 tons of pellets per day. And they had, for the majority of their feedstock, a contract with a local sawmill company, and only some of the feedstock would come from a large number of farmers, which is of course a less secure feedstock source. But in general, they were looking good for their feedstock, and that is a main bankability criterion that must be fulfilled to leverage money, so they could get a loan and partly finance it themselves out of their own funds, and we're developing sales and setting up the project. Next slide, please. So in this case, as I said, the main challenges did not occur during project development so much, but they were actually caught by surprise that once the plant was built, operations were not running as smoothly as they had expected. So they found themselves in difficulties that they did not get as much feedstock from the farmers as they had hoped. The feedstock was partially dumped in front of the company's site, and so it was contaminated with stones or other material. There was a fire hazard, and simply they were not able to develop very good relationships with the farmers. Their representatives were sometimes not even admitted to villages because farmers had wrong ideas or simply were against the use of the biomass at the plant because they were afraid maybe the animals wouldn't have enough feed and so on. Next slide, please. So the main emphasis here then is on addressing operational challenges. So setting up a plant is one thing, but as you will find, things aren't over once you are operational and have financed everything. Then you still need to deal with your day-to-day business, and in this case, they had to be very inventive and innovative, I would say, to solve their problems. They created a non-governmental organization called Punakumba, which was kind of an intermediate between the company and the farmers. It was working with the local university and was convincing the farmers that burning biomass in the field is not a good idea and giving it to the pellet plant was a better idea. They were at the same time providing the farmers with know-how about improving their yields, adopting better practices, and obviously they couldn't be against that. So over time, the company was able to gain the trust of the farmers through this independent organization, and the process was much improved and the feedstock was of much better quality and simply became more over time. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide here. Simply the outcomes are very good. So you see that they've been building 2 more plants since then. Farmers have more income through the sales of the residue that they produce. There is less pollution not only in the field but also better health for the users of the fuel. Rather than using brown like lignite or black coal, they're now using pellets. There is less dust. There is less greenhouse gas emissions. They actually participated in the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, United Nations process with their project. They got an award, I think actually 2 awards. And lots of employment was created through the project, and you see the critical success factors among having one large provider of fuel for the plant have been the creation of this NGO and simply the innovativeness of this company to resolve the problems as they presented themselves. So insistence sometimes really pays off. So thanks for your attention. Next slide, and that's the end of my part.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation, Martin. I would like now to open the question and answers section of this webinar. I believe my colleague Jeff had a few questions that he would like to answer first.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. So there were questions regarding the increased use of wood. For example, one question was that wouldn't this increase the risk of deforestation? Another question was, wouldn't this be costlier than just collecting the wood in the forest? So let me say the situation today is in developing countries, a lot of wood is used already for cooking, and it's by and large collected from forests, so it's risking deforestation today. And by and large, it's very costly, even though in principle the wood is free for the person collecting it. It's not free for the environment. You're threatening the existing forest, and it also takes a lot of time to collect the wood, and also the cook stoves are very polluting and cause thousands and thousands of deaths. So what we're proposing is on the supply side for farmers, smallholders, to grow their own wood through an agroforestry approach, which with the self-fertilizing wood crops would actually double or triple the yields of the food crops so that they can grow some wood on their agricultural land, not the forest. and grow that food on their agricultural land without reducing their food production. Because often they're only getting 20% of the potential yield, so it could easily be doubled or tripled. And then on the demand side, to install more clean and efficient cook stoves so that they can use much less wood, maybe 1/3 or 1/2 as much wood, again, further reducing the cost and further reducing the pressure on the environment. So that's a quick answer to those complicated questions.
Thank you, Jeff. I would like to now ask our guest speakers to answer a couple of questions. So first, Cornelius, if you had to pick the 3 most important elements to focus on when you need to prepare a bankable project proposals, which ones would those be?
Yes, the 3 key ingredients to making a biomass project bankable is a feedstock supply agreement, an offtake agreement or a solid market study, and an EPC contract or a reputable energy or equipment supplier and installer. EPC stands for Engineer, Procure, Construct, Contract. Many investors and banks will only consider financing your bioenergy project after a feedstock supply agreement and an offtake agreement are in place. A lender might even limit the term of the loan to the period of these agreements. So if you come up with a 3-year feedstock supply agreement, they will say, okay, we give you a 3-year bank loan. In reality, it's either costly or impossible to procure feedstock for a long period or as long as a bank loan is typically required. This conundrum may be solved by providing independent third-party feedstock assessments that show that really sufficient feedstock is available in the long term. The same frequently applies for an offtake agreement. Off-takers such as utilities with a large enough balance sheet to support the agreement, they usually require annual volumes in excess of what the small to medium-sized projects can deliver. Selling into a well-established market or solid market assessment may de-risk the investment. And then other components, the third component of a business plan should include quotes from technology vendors and engineering plant design, as well as an assessment of key risks. It's all about risk assessment. Consider yourself as a refinery. Also, instead of refining oil, you refine wood to a biofuel. All of this is complicated. So the key take-home message is biofuel projects are more challenging renewable energy to develop than other renewables. But the IRENA Project Navigator, the IRENA tools such as the business brief and the business plan template will help you in the process and getting to where you need to get. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Cornelius. Our next question will be for Martin. So the question is, what are the main certification schemes which are used to ensure that the feedstock supply is sustainable? Sorry.
Very good question. I was kind of hoping for that one because certification becomes very significant whenever you want to access international markets. I think there's a slide on certification schemes. I believe it's number 61, if you can show that. There are a number of schemes. As said, it's mainly relevant for large projects where you want to export. If you want to export to Europe, to Japan, or other such countries, the purchasing parties like large power plants or whoever distributes pellets in that country, they will often ask you where your feedstock comes from. So certification is meant to give your product kind of an official stamp of approval. So it's kind of, it depends on which market you want to export to, what type of certification you will choose. So you will have to talk to your buyers, to your off-takers as to what type of certification they prefer, and then you will find out the certification will cover many issues, not just the environmental sustainability, but also the social aspects of your project. So it's actually very important to do this all and make such decisions early in the process when you're still developing your project. because you have to document everything. People will come to your company, they will actually audit you, they will look for papers, they will look for proof that what you're claiming about the product is true, so you have to show where does your feedstock come from, have you consulted with local communities, what is your record of reforestation if you cut trees, or of protecting the land where the feedstock comes from. Have you have any issues at your factory or anything like that? So these things are very important, as it can be very complex, and it may sometimes be easier to just aim for a local market where the criteria aren't quite as strict. But anyway, so there's a preliminary list of feedstocks, which you can also have certification schemes. You can also find that in chapter 3, I believe it is, assessment, in the online version of the guidelines. So I hope that makes sense. If you want to know anything else, please ask.
Thank you very much, Martin. Maybe before we go, I would like to ask Simone to provide us with a short summary of the tools and the templates that will be available with the guidelines that have just been launched, and maybe give us a presentation on the main ones.
Yes, thank you, Carlos, for this question. I think it came out a couple of times during the webinar. So you can see on your screen that for each of the steps of the project development cycle, the guidelines will provide a certain set of tools and templates that will help you to achieve the milestone for each of the phases. So for example, if you go to the next slide, you will see, for example, we have a project evaluation tool which helps developer translate technical parameters into economic and financial output, I would say. So you're able to study the relationship between a certain change in the design or the configuration of your project with regard to financial performance, for example. So this is one of the tools. So this is a bit to analyze your project, also to present it, to prepare bankable project proposal. We provide certain templates. So if we go to the next slide, yes, so we provide certain templates. For example, Cornelius mentioned that one of the requirements for bankability for Woody Biomass project is the to have available a feedstock supply agreement. So here we provide, based on sources in the industry, template for feedstock supply agreement. On the next slide also, we provide, to help you summarize, because it's sometimes difficult to acquire a huge amount of information, data for your project, and so we help you to crystallize all those information into a brief document that you can provide to stakeholders of your project, but also investors or potential lenders. So this is also something that you can take for you. You can access it, download it, and you can use it directly on your project. So this is a bit of sample of the tools, templates we provide in the guidelines. They are available online, but also they can be used offline. Carlos, we had also a question regarding what are the other tools IRENA is providing to support the development of bioenergy projects. Can you maybe describe a bit the overall tools and showcase one of them?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Simon. This would be just a bit of a reminder that there are other project development tools created by IRENA. The Navigator is only one of them. Just to name a few, we have the Sustainable Energy Marketplace, the Global Atlas, the IRENA ADFD project facility, and the Resource Portal. Together, we try to provide project development assistance at all stages of the process. To go a bit into an example, the Global Atlas launched a bioenergy simulator, which gives its users the ability to estimate the potential yields of bioenergy produced anywhere in the world. And it's now actually looking for the public to help it validate its data and make it better. So that's one of the tools. With this, I would like to say that this is all the time that we have available for questions. If you have a question that has not been answered, we really encourage you to get in touch with us at the Navigator team at navigator@irena.org. Before we conclude today, we would like to ask for your feedback once again in order to improve our webinar series. You will see a question pop up on your screen, and again, you will only need to select your answer. Thank you very much for your opinion. It is now time to close this webinar. We apologize for the technical difficulties that we faced. We hope that you enjoyed it. Just as a reminder, you will be the slide deck that we used for this webinar will be distributed, and also the guidelines will be available online on the Navigator platform. Thank you for your feedback, and thank you very much for joining us. If you wish to get in touch with us, again, please just send an email to navigator@irena.org. We look forward to hearing from you.